We're going to talk about toxic foods and detox foods, and mostly we're going to talk about toxic foods. And the first culprit that we're going to talk a lot about is genetically modified organisms, so GMOs. For Reboot, we've only taken out GMO oils because, again, that's the really highly concentrated area that the plants store the chemical fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides all really in the fat cells. So for the most part, that's the most concentrated part of the plant. But genetically modified organisms in general are really important to avoid. So we're going to go into why and then what those really are when you're looking at your food, just how prevalent it is. So there are three different types of genetic modifications that are done to plants. And originally it started with corn. That was the first genetically modified crop in 1996, was the first genetically modified crop. And so the first reason why they genetically modified the plant was to be able to withstand Roundup or glyphosate, which is the weed killer. So that they could spray the plants and everything with the weed killer, the plant would live and everything else would die so that they didn't have to weed. Brilliant. However, glyphosate is a known carcinogen, first of all. The second type of genetic modification is Bt toxin. So Bt, this came a little bit later on in genetic modification, but Bt had been being used as an overspray. It's a bacteria, natural bacteria that's found in the soil. And when Bt is eaten, that bacteria is digested by a bug. It makes most bugs self-digest or die anyway. So it kills bugs. So they had been spraying Bt onto plants for years, doing overspray as a pesticide. But when they genetically modified the plant, they actually took the DNA of Bt, this Bt bacteria, stands for bacillo something or other, bacteria. They took the DNA of that and the DNA of the plant and they put them together. So it would be like having a cat human or something. Like they don't go. It's not even the same, bacteria and plant aren't the same genus and there's nothing similar about them anyway. So the plant now is part Bt, so it's part Bt toxin. So any bug that bites the plant, instead of having it topically on the plant, which you could in theory rinse off, now it's part of the plant. So there's absolutely no rinsing this off. So any bug that bites the plant will die. So back to Roundup. Glyphosate being applied is now a part of the plant. The plant has taken it up. And Bt toxin, again, is now a genetic part of the makeup of the plant. When we eat a plant that has been genetically modified for each of those reasons, it kills all bacteria. So it kills all of the bugs that bite the plant, but it also kills all of the bacteria, all the bugs in our gut. So our gut bacteria is really responsible for so many of our metabolic processes, hormones, and your people refer to it as the gut mind. A lot of the metabolic processes in the body with hormones, and I'm talking like serotonin, dopamine, or whatever, are largely regulated in the abdomen, not in the brain. Like you think about your emotions and you think, oh, that's happening in my brain. And it is somewhat with your pituitary gland, but a large portion of those initial signals are actually initiated in your gut. And without the proper gut bacteria, those signals get depleted and or lost. And one of the cycles that's set up, without healthy gut bacteria, your body can't produce tryptophan, which then signals a different chain of events, which eventually leads to your body not producing or regulating insulin properly. So if you wanted to look at it as just as you don't have gut bacteria, you don't have proper insulin regulation, there's a link right there between these foods and potential diabetes or the processes that lead up to diabetes, which is overweight, obesity, blah, 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 blah. The third type of genetic modification is actually, I think, almost scarier if that's possible, than the first two. So the third type of genetic modification is for genetic expression. So if they want a plant to, like an apple, to be white when you cut it. So there are apples, and I'm going to say that these are probably the ones that you can find at the fast food restaurants, although I'm sure you could buy them in the grocery store too, that you cut and they don't turn brown. That oxidative process doesn't happen. So they've genetically modified this plant to not oxidize. How, I don't know. But so in order to get a plant to have a different genetic expression, like a tomato that gets red before it's ripe, or whatever the case may be, in order to change that genetic expression, they take the genetic markers and they add an additional marker to get that genetic expression to actually happen. So they're promoter genes. So they try to wake those, or they do wake those genetic expression genes up with a promoter gene. But the thing is, there's now a promoter gene that's free. So if you kind of look at things like this and this are supposed to go together, and you add this, well, what is that doing? So all of us have, and this is kind of the theory of many people, that a lot of us, or all of us, have latent genes that we don't necessarily want to wake up. So we all have our genetics, and then there's epigenetics, and you can either open the software for cancer or some of the other latent processes that are in our body. You can either open those programs like a computer program, or you can choose not to open those programs. So these promoter genes may very well be opening programs, or getting those latent genes to wake up, or latent cells to wake up. But we don't know the answer to that. So that's an unknown. And in science, they usually follow what's called the precautionary principle, which is until you prove that it's safe in humans for an extended period of time, and I don't know what that period of time is, you don't do it. But they've thrown that out the window when it comes to genetically modified plants, because the protein or the macronutrient makeup of these plants is in theory still the same. So in other words, a genetically modified apple has the same amount of carbohydrate and protein and calories as a not genetically modified apple. Therefore, they're the same. So we don't need to worry about it then. And genetically modified foods are totally unregulated well, not totally unregulated. They're not looked at for that reason, because this one is the same as this one as far as the macronutrients are concerned. So the precautionary principle is kind of thrown out the window. However, when you look at some of the things that have been, we're going to get into that, but there are a lot of studies that have been done to show the correlation between the changes in human disease processes and the introduction of GMO foods, or the use of glyphosate and BT in mass doses. And a lot of those disease processes have increased at the same rate as the introduction and prevalence of the use of these chemicals. So, and that says nothing really of the third type of genetic modification. It's really looking at only the first two, or even just the first one, which is glyphosate. When you eat a genetically modified oil, it is high in omega-6. So that omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, we talked about this a little bit last week. Omega-6s are perfectly fine when they're in balance with omega-3s. But when you get a large imbalance of omega-6, you have way too many omega-6 and not enough omega-3s, then it becomes really inflammatory to the body, and it causes inflammation. It causes the body to be in an acidic state. So, and again, remember I talked about last week that an acidic state of our cells really signals our body to start the decomposition process, or signals the bacteria and microbes and fungus and all of that are living in our body to start the decomposition process. So we're decomposing early. So that's not healthy aging. That's stuff that we want to actually avoid. So bringing that omega-3, omega-6 ratio back down. So when you're consuming GMO foods, you're consuming foods that have a high level of omega-6s, and it makes it very, very difficult to get enough omega-3s to bring that balance back. So that's the same that goes for, you're not just looking at, when you look at processed foods, you're not just looking at you consuming the corn, or you consuming the soybean, or the soybean oil, or any of those things. You're also looking at what did your animals eat? Because the same thing that's happening to you when you consume those GMO things are happening to the animal. And then if you're eating that egg or that chicken or that fish, because yes, fish are raised largely, when they are farm raised, they are farm raised on genetically modified corn and soy. So you can't escape it unless you're buying organic or non-GMO or wild caught foods. And it's just to really consider what the GMOs are doing when they enter your body, which we'll get into a little bit more. So besides the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, which is actually exactly what causes these problems. So having an increased omega-6 or an acidic state in the body is an inflammatory state, and chronic inflammation leads to chronic inflammatory disease. Dr. Nancy Swanson did many, many studies over the course of her time trying to determine what disease processes were actually increased at the same time as the introduction of glyphosate. And what she found was there was actually a direct correlation with many of the diseases, and some of them not necessarily inflammatory diseases, but neurological diseases. And, you could say that there are a number of different factors that could have affected it, and that's certainly true. But when you look at the graphs, it's pretty interesting to see the correlation. So when you look at the graphs, like you can see diabetes. So the purple line is in where the glyphosate was introduced, or the Roundup was introduced, and the red line is the disease process. So in 1996, so we've got a nice steady, slight increase, because probably people with, diabetes, probably people were starting to really consume a lot more sugar than they had in years past with processed foods and all of that. But in 1996, they introduced glyphosate, and all of a sudden that disease process spikes at the same rate as the amount of glyphosate. This is per 1,000 pounds of glyphosate. So as they increased it by, because every year they would have to use more glyphosate on the crops, and also just more crops were being genetically modified. It was becoming more and more and more common until you get to today. So you can see that line as a direct increase with it, with obesity, with rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, irritable bowel syndrome, Alzheimer's disease, acute kidney disease, Parkinson's disease. So, and again, the lines are all just right the same. Thyroid cancer, liver and bile duct cancer. So some cancers are really more prevalent. It seems like they really followed that line more than other cancers that seem to be less related. And then there's also been a sharp increase in autism. In 1996, the autism rate was extremely low, and it had been steadily low. It had been about, the same for 20 or 30 years. And I don't know if you think back when I was in school, I didn't know anybody that was autistic. And now there's so many, the prevalence is so high. So it's gone about 40% increase since the introduction of glyphosate. So, or the introduction of glyphosate used on GMO crops. So again, is it the GMOs, is it glyphosate, or is it a compilation of things? So when you're exposed to a certain amount of this and a certain amount of that, your body can handle it. But when you're exposed to so much of everything, it's like the straw that broke the camel's back. And your body just eventually says, too much. And I think little bodies are even more so. So when babies are born, they can look at the umbilical cord blood or the baby's blood when they're first born, and they already have something like, most babies have like 32 chemicals in utero that are coursing through their veins too, because that's what mom is exposed to, So it's really not it's not a huge mystery that a lot of these disease processes have increased when the foods that we're eating are just so contaminated with chemicals. So just want to back up real quick to this one, because I thought it was interesting. Cancer rates were 1 in 64, and this was in 1976, I believe, that cancer used to be 1 in 64 people would have cancer in their lifetime. And as of today, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 2 men will have cancer at some point in their life, which is unbelievably high. I mean, that's not a rate that is a normal, like, disease process increase rate. Like, something has obviously gone fundamentally wrong in something that we're doing. And the only thing that we can definitely say that all of us are doing is eating. So you really have to look to that for the cause. Cancer is now the leading cause of death in children, including accidents. So children don't die of cancer, right? Yes, they do. It's crazy how many children have cancer. I've got a few friends whose little ones have cancer, and it's just, again, it's not unheard of like it was when we were, or when I was young. So, and then another statistic that is really interesting and actually, unfortunately, growing, is that 1 in 3 children born after the year 2000 will develop type 2 diabetes by the time they're 20. So type 2 diabetes is the kind of diabetes that you can prevent. And so, again, back to where I was saying that killing your gut bacteria can lead to those problems where your insulin regulation gets not necessarily shut off, but definitely not as regulated as it's supposed to be. And you have to wonder, is that part of the reason why? Diabetes, type 2 diabetes, is related to weight gain and sugar consumption. And they say, lack of exercise. And being an exercise physiologist and working with adults and children, I know that you cannot outtrain a bad diet. You can work out all day long, but you can't outtrain a bad diet. If you continue to eat the wrong foods, your body is continuing to get the problem signals, and no matter how much you exercise, it's really not going to help the problem. However, even without exercise, and I'm not a proponent of that either, but even without exercising, changing your diet to include basically what we're doing in Reboot changes your blood sugar almost immediately, even though we're consuming sugar. So some people will say, like, well, you can change your blood sugar if you did like the Atkins diet and you didn't consume sugars. I've had type 1 diabetes who did Reboot, monitoring their sugar, that were eating the carbohydrates and the sweet foods that are Reboot friendly, and still had to decrease his insulin. And he was a type 1 diabetic. And most type 2 diabetics also either have to regulate their insulin down, or if they were borderline, are no longer borderline. And that's not from not eating carbohydrates, and that's not from not eating sweet foods, but sweetened with those like we're doing during Reboot, and clean eating afterwards, those left spin sugars, and not taking in those toxins. I have many clients that have gone from borderline diabetes to perfectly normal blood sugar levels, and stayed that way just by eating clean. So it's not just sugar. Although sugar is definitely the devil, and we'll talk about that next week too. So we talked about genetically modified foods, and the chemical companies that create glyphosate, or I'm just going to give it one name, Dow, that creates glyphosate, Roundup, and Monsanto, which are subsidiaries of one another, so Dow is creating all the chemicals, and Monsanto is controlling all the seeds, so the genetically modified seed. So you have to wonder, why is our food being made and modified by the world's largest pesticide manufacturer? Like, why would we decide that we want our food that makes up all of our food, really, to be made by a chemical company and regulated by a chemical company? And they're very, very powerful. So legislation has been put into, we've tried to pass legislation to control some of this and decrease some of this, and they win. They have so much money. So in order to have them not necessarily win, you need to be the one to stop supporting the system. So it's happened in our Hannaford here in Gray, which I love to see. A few years ago when I started taking people through Reboot, we used to do a grocery store tour, and there were so few things. I'm like, okay, this is only going to take 5 minutes because there's 10 things besides the produce that you can have while you're on Reboot. And now there's a lot more. There's a lot more options. And one of my clients sent me a picture the other day. She walked into Hannaford and it said, we now have 256 organic items in the store, which I thought was fantastic. I'm like, 256, there used to be 5. That's so good. So we are creating the change because so many people in this town have, you know, whether they've learned it on their own or they've rebooted, and I have rebooted most of this town. I really have. But we're, you know, it's supply and demand. If they're going to have organic apples that are going to rot and nobody's buying them, of course they're not going to resupply that. But so we are making a change, and the more people that know about GMOs and stop supporting the system, the more healthy options are going to become available, and the more change, and eventually, hopefully, somehow it'll reach a tipping point, and we'll stop as a nation allowing them to produce it, because it is costly. So, you know, some people say it was so much more expensive to shop this way, and it is more expensive, definitely. You can spend it now at the grocery store, or you can spend it at the doctor's office, and it's definitely true. I mean, these medications and co-pays and everything else are not inexpensive. It is so expensive to have cancer, right? So, and again, that's 1 in 2 men, 1 in 3 women at some point in their lifetime. I would rather spend it at the grocery store. Thank you. You know, and change that statistic. These slides are repeat slides from last week, that food is your medicine. So not only can food make you really sick, but food can make you really well if you are eating the proper foods that have the proper nutrition. You've replaced your gut bacteria so that you can absorb those nutrients too. Because without the proper gut bacteria, or without decreasing the inflammation in your gut, you're not absorbing the nutrients that you're consuming at nearly the rate that you would if you had healthy gut bacteria and if you weren't eating foods that are inflammatory to you. So again, inflammatory to everybody is sugar, but we're finding out if if gluten or lactose are inflammatory foods for you, because if your body is busy doing something that it is having a hard time doing, it is not absorbing nutrients. So we're finding out the answers to those questions, but it really is important to get that gut bacteria back so that you can absorb your nutrients, and then making sure that you're eating all those micronutrients that are really bringing that health. So you are what you eat. Again, so are the cows, the pigs, the fish, the chicken, the eggs. Power foods are extremely important to bring that micronutrient profile to the table, not just the macronutrients like your protein and carbohydrates. And then doing the detox foods. So last week we talked about a lot of those, not only superfoods, but detox foods. I hope that you've added some of those. I know that a lot of you have added them in your smoothies, getting the chlorophyll in there. So to get those micronutrients and to start pulling some of the toxins out of your body. And it's not necessarily toxins that you've eaten. So most of your products that you're putting on your body are toxic as well. And your skin, unfortunately, we absorb through our skin and it bypasses the liver. So it's even worse than eating, because your liver cleans out some of the toxins for you if it can keep up. But when you put something on your skin that's toxic, it goes right directly to your bloodstream. There's a really cool app that I just got called Think Dirty. It rates all of the products on a scale of 1 to 10 for toxicity and carcinogenity. 8, 9, and 10 are red. 5, 6, and 7 are yellow, like probably not the greatest idea. And anything with a 5 and below was green light, okay? There was 1 deodorant in the whole store. It was at 5. And I was like, yay, it's Axe Apollo. Random, because all of the other Axe products are a 10 or a 9. But Axe Apollo deodorant, so you know, if you're a man, this one has a 5. The Shea Moisture products are also really good. They have, shampoo and conditioner. All of them were rated like a 3 or a 4. Some of the things that you would think are good, like Jason, or not good. Not good at all. Like, I think some of the Jason products were 9s and 10s. The app is really cool because it'll give you the list of what the ingredients are, how each one of those ingredients is rated and why. And then it also gives you alternatives. So there's just a couple of, there's a million movies that I love, but I've written a few of them here. My favorite is definitely Food Matters. It's the one that people are like, seriously, this is what we're doing. If you've already seen Food Matters, Fat, Sick, and Nearly Dead is great. There's a second one of those. You can see Fat, Sick, and Nearly Dead free on their website, and there's actually recipes on their website too. So they have a lot of reboot-friendly recipes, smoothies. They do their own reboot, which is different than this reboot, but it's a lot of the recipes would definitely be okay on this reboot. The Truth About Cancer, I highly, highly support. The first, it talks about like, how did we get here where 1 in 3 women and 1 in 2 men will have cancer in their lifetime? Like, what is the cause of this? So a lot of it is the bad news. And again, it's not just what we're eating, it's environmental and emotional stuff too. And then EMFs and all of the, technologies that we're exposed to, that God knows what that's doing, as the, EMFs are definitely making it through your body if they're making it through that concrete wall. At the beginning of the series talks about kind of like, how did we get here where so many of us are either suffering with cancer or know somebody close to us that is dealing with cancer. And then after the first 3 episodes, really goes into some of the amazing things that have been discovered in this country and largely out of this country that go a long way to prevent and also cure cancer, besides the big 3, chemo, radiation, and surgery. So not necessarily that those things don't have their place, but supporting your body through it and just knowing that these things exist to prevent cancer, which is huge. There's a lot. Basically what you're doing with Reboot is preventing cancer. And we're going to get into that a little bit more when we talk about sugar next week. Fresh is really cool. It's about supporting organic local farmers and really making a huge difference there too. So if you have the opportunity, like you want to do a CSA, that farmer now knows that they have pre-sold all of this. And once they know that they've pre-sold, let's say to 200 people, they know that all I have to do this year is man the farm. I know exactly how much I need to grow, and I can make it this year. And Maine is one of the, if not the top state, it's one of the top states for organic farming and CSAs, which is really cool. And I think Vermont we're either 1 or 2, Maine and Vermont. So it's really good to know that, you're supporting, again, that, vote with your dollars and support that farming, because sustainable farming is integral to sustainable human life. Because eventually the depletion of soil and our pollinators and everything else, if we continue down this GMO road without balancing it some way, is going to have a detrimental effect. One more movie that I really love that's not on this list is Fed Up. And that one is about sugar, and so normally I would talk about that one next week. But if you're gonna have a documentary binge watching weekend, which I do sometimes, that one's really good. And I believe that is the end.